Welcome back to the MSU Deer Labs online seminar series brought to you by the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. I'm Bronson Strickland and I will be the presenter today. I'd like to also acknowledge my co-author, Steve Damaris, colleague of mine and co-director of the MSU Deer Lab. Today I want to focus on all of the aspects of getting a place prepared to plant for food plots. What are all the things you need to do ahead of time, planting equipment, etc. So that's really what this presentation is about, is the background and preparation for a food plot system on your property. All right, we've talked a lot about white-tailed deer. Let's move on now to talking about food plots themselves. And where I want to begin with is the site itself. How do you go about picking a particular site for a food plot to set you up for success? These are common situations here and questions. Where should I plant? Do I plant in an existing opening? Of course, you want to locate a plot where deer are going to feel secure to use the plot. Places like near travel corridors, and of course, you have to have well-drained soils. And I'll go into a little further detail here. Here's a very simple example. On the left, you have a not an ideal situation. On the right, you have a much more ideal situation. So this brown color here I have as cover, representing cover. The white is representing open space, and of course green is the food plot. What's not ideal, keeping in mind that this is going to be for punting, you want to actually view deer during daylight hours on these food plots, is making sure that the deer are going to feel secure moving from cover to the food plot. And if you have a great deal of open space in between those two, you are without a doubt going to minimize the number of deer you're going to see on that plot during daylight hours. On the right hand side, the ideal situation is you're going to have a food plot adjacent to, maybe it's not bedding cover, maybe deer are not bedded directly next to the food plot, but you want to have enough concealment cover so that a deer is going to feel secure enough to navigate from where it is bedding and entering the food plot. This is a very common situation where I'm at, places where I hunt and manage, is we have very flat clay soils. And there's a lot of clovers that can tolerate, just for an example, can tolerate very wet soil. None of them are going to tolerate for long periods of time standing water. So that's why we are always emphasizing have well-drained soils. Now that's relative. You might have a place where there's poorly drained soils, and the best you're going to get is moderately drained soils. But always keep that in mind. You're either not going to get good production if the soils are very wet, and in a lot of cases, if it's a place, an area in general, or even a part of a plot or a field where you're going to plant the food plot, these places that constantly puddle, you're either not going to have any growth whatsoever, in other words, the plant's going to die, or the growth and yield of those plants are going to be minimal. I want to bring your attention to a tool, a free online resource that I use quite often, developed by USDA and NRCS, and it's called the Web Soil Survey. So if you just Google Web Soil Survey, it should pop up, and it's real easy to get started with this tool. And you may be very familiar with your property. If it's your property, you own it, I'm sure you know all the ins and outs and all the good places and places where there shouldn't be a food plot. But if you're new, looking at a property, leasing property, you're new to this land, this is a convenient tool to start the process with. And all you need to do to get going is just click on this green button, Start WSS. And what you'll need to do, there's a lot of different options that you can see here, but the main thing that I want to point you toward is this little tool here. That's the AOI, or Area of Interest. And you can use the zoom in and zoom out tools that you see here, and basically find your property on the map, and then you can even zoom in even more to a particular part of your property. And this is just going to give you a first look at what kinds of soils are on your property and how well drained or not those particular soils are. So this is just an example. I drew a polygon around a property, and what happens is once you construct that polygon, you'll just kind of follow the cues provided by the program, and then you'll notice here on the left, within the polygon that I drew, these are all the different soils that are present. And again, you can see on the left that the acres and percentage of all those different soils are indicated there. Of particular interest is when you click on each of those soils, you'll get a description. And notice what I have outlined here in red is you'll get the description in terms of how well drained, or in this case, poorly drained it is. So nothing, of course, is ever going to beat you being on the ground in person, looking at the situation. This, of course, is not taking into account what is the current cover type, if it's in trees or in pasture, etc. But this is just giving you a good starting point of parts of the property that may be poorly drained and not over the long term going to be well suited for food plots, and which areas are going to be better to pursue. I get the question a lot, and I'm sure you've read this in hunting magazines as well. The question is, what is the ideal shape and size of a food plot for deer and for other wildlife? Well, it really depends on what your goals are. And let me put that in context. If your goal is that you want to see as many deer as possible, then it may be true that a very long, narrow food plot may be the best shape. And the reason for that is you can have a very long and narrow plot adjacent to more cover, and more deer could use it. But it's not the ideal shape from the perspective of production. In other words, how many pounds of food plot biomass are you going to grow? If that is your sole objective, then the ideal size is going to be a big circle or a big square. And the reason for that is just maximizing the amount of sunlight that you're getting 6, 8, or more hours a day. But because plants need sunlight, obviously, to grow. And so the more thin that you have it, you're going to decrease sunlight. You are also going to increase competition from the adjacent cover that you have. And typically, in most places, that's going to be trees. And so you're going to have that edge effect where the canopy of the tree is intercepting sunlight. Then you also have the roots of the trees are also taking up resources like water. So you've got to think of it from that perspective. It's a balance of course, you're growing this so that deer are going to use it and that you can see deer if you're going to hunt over this particular plot. But you also want to balance that with what is the ideal shape for getting sunlight and growing the greatest amount of forage. And here's an example. This is a food plot we created. Notice it is completely bordered by forest, by trees. And in the middle of the day, you can see here that there's a lot of sunlight on this plot. However, when you get towards earlier in the morning or in the afternoon, as the sun is either coming up or the sun is setting, it's going to be a very shady plot. So we are compromising with this food plot. We are not going to get as much biomass production because sunlight is limiting. And we are also going to have competition with tree roots around us for resources. But it is positioned in a good place from a hunting perspective, is that it's adjacent to cover, and you're going to see a lot of deer on this plot. So think about the sunlight gradient here as well. This particular plot, it's narrow. I believe it's about 30 yards wide. and it runs from east to west. So the sun is always going to be on the south side of this plot. It's always going to be coming over these trees that you see on the left-hand side of the food plot, or it's going to be going through the canopy of the trees. So in this particular situation, again, this is going to be a successful area to grow food plots, but we're going to sacrifice some of the production because of sunlight and competition with trees. Another characteristic of this plot that I think is notable is notice that there is a moisture gradient. So it's very difficult to see. I know it looks primarily flat, but there's a little bit of a slope that runs from the right-hand side of the plot downhill to the left-hand side of the plot. And notice the combination of the shading and the slope. You can actually see on the left-hand side here that the color of the soil is different just because of the moisture that's being retained. Now it all depends on, is moisture limited? You know, whether this was a warm season plot or cool season plot, but there are going to be times of the year where on the left-hand side, when there's been a lot of rainfall, you may see some biomass production being limited because of too much moisture, and on the right-hand side, it may do better. And then vice versa for other times of the year. So just another one of the characteristics to keep in mind, along with the shape of it and the sunlight. Also keep in mind these different moisture gradients, and that may actually affect what food plot plant you might put in this plot if you're going to have moisture issues. One more concept I wanted to quickly discuss regarding where you're putting your food plot and even the shape of it. This is from a context of a bow hunter. If you're a gun hunter, probably not a big deal at all. You know, if you're a rifle hunter, you can shoot 100 yards, a couple hundred yards. You just may want to make the plot big enough for forage production, maximize forage production. If you're a bow hunter, though, and you're always concerned about getting deer within 20 or 30 yards or so, you might want to consider some of the designs you see here. Again, the dark brown is representing, that could be forest or cover. And I've put two shapes up here to represent food plots. The one on the left kind of looks like an hourglass or a bow tie or something like that. And the logic behind this is that you've all seen it before. Deer are curious, can be very curious when they enter a food plot. And you'll see it a lot to where a deer will enter a food plot and will actually, if they can't see around a corner, they'll actually move to this funnel spot or pinch point, whatever you want to call it, and they'll move through that narrow area just so they can peek around to see if any other deer are on the plot. Now, I do not have any GPS data. I don't have any collar data showing how many times deer do this when they enter a food plot, but I know this is something I have personally seen, and a lot of colleagues that I trust have seen this as well. So think about that. Can you create a situation where deer will have to move through a particular spot, taking advantage of their curiosity? Another design would be on the right, where you put a sharp turn, and it doesn't have to be a 90-degree turn. It could be a bend, but basically, if you had a deer on the right-hand side of the plot, they are probably going to work their way to the top there, just so they can look over into the left-hand side. So one little tip for you there about design if you're a bow hunter.